Congressman Tom McClintock, who is an extraordinary patriot, who has fought and fought and fought against the system to stand up for our liberties, to stand up for our freedoms, is here from Washington after voting to defund Obamacare. Congressman Tom McClintock.
Thank you, Tim. Good work. Thank you. Well, folks, I sure thank you all for coming out, and I thank you for a very long day. The name of this event, the Liberty Summit, I think defines in a single word all that's at stake in the great debate that's going on now over the future direction of our country. And I think that the theme of today's event, Unite for Liberty, comes at a time when Americans from a broad cross-section of the political spectrum are beginning to realize that their fundamental rights are in jeopardy, and they're beginning to return to those age-old principles of the Constitution and to begin to address what I think will define this period of history and this generation. And that's the question of whether these uniquely American principles that are set forth in the American Declaration of Independence and set in motion by our American Constitution will continue to guide our nation and protect its freedoms in the days ahead. When Abraham Lincoln made his way to Washington, the second night they stopped at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, where he laid out the entire political philosophy of his with these words. He said, "All the political sentiments I entertain have been drawn, so far as I have been able to draw them, from the sentiments which originated in and were given to the world from this hall. I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence." That is what made the American Revolution. It was the principle that there's a certain class of rights that predate all government, so they obviously cannot spring from government. The principal purpose of government is established by human beings to protect these natural rights. This was a treasonous concept to European sensibilities, and the European view to this very day. Rights come from the government. The French revolutionaries who tried to imitate the American Revolution missed the very essence of it. As de Tocqueville noted during his travels, the French believed that their rights come from a Committee on the Rights of Man. And they discovered to their horror that if rights can be granted by governments, then those same rights can be taken away by those governments. The Americans, he said, believe their rights come from God and that no earthly power can ever alienate them. He said, do Americans believe in God? He says, I don't know. I can't look into the hearts of men. But I know this. The Americans believe that this concept is absolutely essential to the preservation of their liberty. It was this uniquely American view of the nature of human rights that created our voluntary society. I think Jefferson summed it up best in his first inaugural address after cataloging the bountiful blessings the nation enjoyed. He asked, with all these blessings, what more is necessary to make us a happy and a prosperous people? Still one thing more, fellow citizens, a wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government, and this is necessary to close the circle of our felicities. This was a revolutionary departure from the compulsory societies of Europe. In these compulsory societies, the sovereign sets the direction for society. The sovereign allocates the resources, assigns the rights, and makes the decisions of how society is to move to achieve them. In both the voluntary and the compulsory society, government is very important, but for very different reasons. The voluntary society is one directed by the individual decisions of free citizens as they chart their own paths through life. The government guards the conditions that are necessary for them to do so. It restrains people from injuring one another. It provides a stable currency. It protects the sanctity of contracts and the security of property that makes human exchange possible. It shields the commons and provides for the common defense. And it superintends the basic infrastructure upon which human civilization depends. Within this very simple, defined, and limited framework, individuals make their own decisions how to allocate their own time and resources and how to live their own lives. The sum total of their individual choices, made hundreds of times a day, is what defines the path of a voluntary society of which government is supposed to be an obedient servant. At a very practical level, this means we decide for ourselves where we wish to live, what we wish to eat, what light bulbs we prefer, how high we'll turn up the thermostat in our own living rooms, how we'll get to work, how much water we'll have in our toilet bowls, and we vote every day with every dollar we spend on what those priorities should be. The compulsory society needs government to compel individuals to subordinate their individual hopes and aspirations to the collective designs of the state, all for the greater good, of course. And that requires great heaping gobs of government, because it's not easy to force people to act against their own interests or their own moral judgments or their own best judgment. That takes force. It takes a lot of force and a lot of bureaucrats to micromanage every facet of daily life. I think the American people have received a very clear look at what a compulsory society looks like over these past 5 years, and they're getting a particularly good look at it over the past few months. In the compulsory society, the government, and not individual consumers, picks winners and losers in the marketplace. In this society, bankers or industrialists who share government's favor are bailed out by hard-working taxpayers with the excuse, oh, well, we're all in this together. Companies like Solyndra, that cannot earn the trust of consumers through their own merit, force consumers to buy their products or underwrite their losses with the excuse that government must guide the economy. Under the banner of sustainable communities, government will encourage and threaten and, if need be, force all of us to live in dense urban cores and conserve every drop of water and every watt of electricity in our dim and dismal homes. Where we're told that such a compulsory society reclaims American values. Well, let there be no mistake. The advocates of the compulsory society are not reclaiming American values. They are fundamentally rejecting them and replacing them with values that are alien and antithetical to those which built our nation. The voluntary society also needs government. It needs government to restrain individuals from violating the natural rights of others. The compulsory society needs government to compel individuals to act in a manner that comports with the vision of government, even if it means violating the natural rights of others. The compulsory society needs government to allocate resources. The voluntary society needs government to protect individuals as they allocate their own resources. The compulsory society needs government to indoctrinate and inculcate every individual with its common vision for society. The voluntary society needs government to protect the freedom of speech which allows robust and constant testing of ideas. In short, the compulsory society disdains constitutional constraints on government and the free choices by individuals, while the voluntary society insists on them. Now, 4 months ago, the President of the United States addressed students at Ohio State University, where he extolled the benign virtues of an all-powerful government and told the students to ignore those who warn of its dangers. You remember that speech? It was just 1 week later that Americans awoke to learn that for the last several years, the government has employed one of its most powerful and feared agencies to harass ordinary Americans because of their political beliefs, with the clear intention of intimidating them into withdrawing from exercising their right to participate in the public policy debate. Nearly 500 conservative groups involving tens of thousands of individual Americans were subjected to invasive review and intimidation when they attempted to file for 501c status. That's the same status, by the way, that's routinely granted for such advocacy groups as MoveOn.org and the ACLU and the League of Conservation Voters. the IRS demanded the names of every participant at every meeting these groups held over a period of years, transcripts of every speech given at those meetings, what positions they'd taken on issues, the names of their volunteers and donors, and in some cases, of their families and associates, and copies of privileged communications with elected officials. In some cases, the person filing the request was then subjected to a personal income tax audit. The Venerable Leadership Institute, which has been schooling young people in constitutional principles for 40 years, was put through a year-long audit. The IRS wasn't only interested in financial information, it wanted the names of their students and college interns and the names of anybody who had subsequently hired them. And when the IRS wasn't demanding the names of ordinary Americans or what they were reading or thinking or saying or even praying, in some cases applicants were actually given names and told to reveal what they knew about these people. I wondered what all these names were used for, and I think I found out last month when I conducted a telephone conference call with constituents. One man told the story of having gone to a couple of Tea Party meetings. That's all he did. Signed a sign-up sheet as it went around. And within about 6 months, he found himself under the first audit in his lifetime by the IRS. And he said one of the principal lines of questioning involved not his finances, but his affiliation with the Tea Party, something that his financial and tax records would have absolutely nothing to do with. Well, a week after the IRS scandal broke, Americans awakened to other news. That the Justice Department had surreptitiously seized the telephone records of some 20 reporters covering Washington for the Associated Press in an obvious attempt to discourage whistleblowers from talking to them. And according to the CEO of AP, it worked. The whistleblowers stopped talking to them. Then Fox News reporter James Rosen and his family were stalked by authorities as he tried to get to the bottom of the Benghazi scandal. Indeed, during this period, the government was far more interested in the comings and goings of Rosen's elderly mother than they were in the activities of the Tsarnaev brothers, despite urgent and explicit warnings from the Russian government. In order to search and wiretap the homes of Rosen and his family, the Attorney General of the United States filed an absolutely spurious claim with the federal court, alleging that Rosen was conspiring to violate the Espionage Act. Now that's the same act under which Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed in 1953. The message to reporters that are asking inconvenient questions of the administration could not possibly have been more powerful or terrifying. Well, then 2.5 months ago, Americans woke to news that the federal government swept up the phone and internet records of hundreds of millions of Americans in the name of state security. Now these are precisely the kind of indiscriminate searches conducted by British authorities that John Adams said gave birth to the fight for American independence. The founders specifically wrote the Fourth Amendment to assure that indiscriminate government searches never happened in America. In America, in order for the government to invade your privacy or to go through your private records, it must first present some evidence that justifies its suspicion against you, and then it has to specify what records or things it is looking for. Well, we were told, oh, don't worry, the government's not looking at content, but only metadata, and only for purposes of catching terrorists. Well, both claims are irrelevant. Your phone records are your private records, and if I know who you call and how long you talk to them and how often you talk to them, I already know a very great deal about you and your personal life. But it turns out that was also a lie. A week after that, The Guardian broke the story of the X-Keyscore program, which included a training presentation for NSA analysts. It clearly shows the government routinely views email and content of ordinary Americans without a warrant. In some cases, NSA analysts were routinely perusing the email of love interests. And 2 weeks after that, we learned that the information gleaned by these indiscriminate, warrantless searches is routinely turned over to domestic agencies, including the DEA and the IRS, to be used in prosecuting American citizens, with law enforcement agencies fabricating circumstances to hide from the defendant and the juries and the judge the true origins of this information through a process with an Orwellian name of parallel construction. You know, a few years ago, a federal prosecutor bragged to a friend of mine, quote, "We can make a paddle to fit anyone's ass." Now, I submit to you, that is not the boast of a free society. That is the boast of a totalitarian state, and as it turns out, it is no idle boast. And then 2 months ago, this administration again asserted that the president has legal authority to nullify any law that he deems objectionable or inconvenient, and to impose new laws through the regulatory bureaucracies that the elected Congress has specifically refused to enact. If these acts are allowed to stand, the fundamental checks and balances envisioned in the Constitution will be rendered meaningless. And then just 3 weeks ago, the ultimate breakdown of these constitutional checks and balances, the President briefly asserted the authority to bypass Congress on the ultimate question of declaring war, which is the single most significant act a government can take, and one clearly and unambiguously reserved to Congress and to Congress alone. You know, for centuries, European monarchs had plunged their nations into bloody and debilitating wars on whim. And the Constitution's framers wanted to protect the American Republic from that fate. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, said that the single most important feature of that document was the provision that gave Congress and not the President the authority to declare war. This is what he wrote in 1793. He said, "In no part of the Constitution is more wisdom to be found than in the clause which confides the question of war or peace to the legislature and not to the executive department. The trust and the temptation would be too great for any one man. War is in fact the true nurse of executive aggrandizement. In war, a physical force is to be created, and it is the executive will which is to direct it. In war, the public treasures are to be unlocked, and it's the executive hand which is to dispense them. Those who are to conduct a war cannot, in the nature of things, be proper or safe judges whether a war ought to be commenced, continued, or concluded," end quote. In Federalist 69, Alexander Hamilton said that one of the most important differences between the British king and the American president is the fact that the king can plunge his nation into war on his command, but that the American president has no such authority. I think this is the next step in the blurring of civil and military jurisdictions, a blurring of the concepts of war and peace that is a frightening breakdown of the constitutional safeguards of our liberty. Starting under Bush and accelerating under Obama, something very insidious has occurred. A gradual transformation of the traditional concept of war, a concentrated, finite armed struggle with undivided resources and the determination of the nation against a hostile government. We've taken that traditional concept and turned it into an ill-defined and perpetual struggle to rid the world of bad people. That's an objective that's guaranteed to go on as long as humanity exists. And on this new altar of perpetual war, we are asked to sacrifice the American Constitution, our rights of due process, and our liberties as a free people. The oath sworn by every official in our government and every member of the armed services is not to preserve, protect, and defend the United States of America. It is not to preserve, protect, and defend the United States government. It is to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. I think the American founders clearly understood something that this generation seems to be forgetting, that if we ever lose our Constitution, we have already lost our country. And we are losing it. Over this past summer, we've witnessed a pattern of conduct throughout this administration that is absolutely toxic to a free society. Government using its powers to intimidate private citizens who are simply trying to take part in the public policy debate. Government using its powers to intimidate reporters from the operation of a free press. Government seizing and monitoring the phone and internet records of every American. and government asserting powers it is explicitly forbidden by our Constitution. In response to the NSA and IRS scandals this summer, the President's spokesman said that, quote, "The law is irrelevant." He called these matters a distraction. What does that say about a society that once prided itself on being a nation of laws and not of men? Ever since we lost Ronald Reagan, we've been slowly and inexorably losing the debate over the size and role of government, whether we should remain a voluntary society or become a compulsory one. I think that may be changing now as Americans begin to consider the implications of all of these developments. Ours wouldn't be the first civilization to succumb to the siren song of a benevolent and all-powerful government. But without a single exception, every civilization that has fallen for that lie has awakened one morning to realize that the benevolence is gone and the all-powerful government is still there. During the coming months, the House will continue to lay out these facts for the American people to judge. Each one of us needs to do everything that we can to engage our friends and neighbors and co-workers and awaken them to the danger that we face from these developments, because I fear if we allow these usurpations to go unchallenged, simply ignore them and go about our daily affairs, a very bright line will have been crossed and the recovery of our liberty will become infinitely more difficult. You know, the American founders referred to a liberty tree. In fact, the liberty tree is emblazoned on one of the Revolutionary War flags. It's a good analogy. Our generation didn't plant that tree. We didn't grow that tree. We were simply handed it by 8 generations of Americans who came before us. We accepted it with all of its blessings, with the solemn obligation to care for it, to protect it, to nurture it, so that it can continue to bear the fruits of liberty for the generations who will follow us. Well, those fruits include the First Amendment that guarantees all Americans the right to our political and religious beliefs and the right to express those beliefs freely without fear of government intimidation or retribution. The Second Amendment that guarantees us the means to protect our families and our freedoms. The Fourth Amendment that forbids the government from seizing our records without probable cause to believe that we've committed a crime. The Fifth Amendment that forbids our government from depriving us of our lives, our liberty, or our property without due process of law. The 10th Amendment that reserves to the states and the people all powers not explicitly granted it by our Constitution. As we leave here today, let's unite for liberty. Let's highly resolve not to rest until we've delivered to our sons and daughters a tree of liberty that is just as healthy, a Constitution that is just as strong, and a nation that is just as free as those that our fathers and mothers gave to us. As Daniel Webster said so long ago, hold fast, my friends, to the Constitution and to the republic for which it stands. For miracles do not cluster. And what has happened once in 6,000 years may not happen again. Hold fast to the Constitution, for if the American Republic should ever fail, there will be chaos throughout the world. Thank you all for everything you're doing in this cause.